Hey everyone, Evan here. Months ago I did a tutorial video of how to put together a Titanic ship model. I'll be glad to read you Making History Titanic. Go start on the first page. Starting with the Ship of Dreams. One summer evening in 1907, the head of the shipping company, White Star Line, Joseph Ismay, enjoyed dinner with Lord Perry, chairman of the shipbuilding company called Harlan and Wolff. Old friends, they discussed the fast new ships being made to carry people to America and decided to build a ship of dreams. There would be extravagant cabins and suites for richer first and second class passengers and plenty of space in third class for immigrants moving to start a new life in North America. Ismay and Perry set out to build 3 ships called RMS Olympic, RMS Titanic, and the RMS Britannic. Titanic was the most luxurious, but it would only ever make one journey. Titanic hit an iceberg and sank on April 15, 1912, killing more than 1,500 passengers and crew. The White Star Line was a British shipping company founded in 1845. It became well known for running some of the most luxurious ships in the world until it emerged with another company in 1934. 2 historical figures. Ismay was the head of the White Star Line, which his father had started. He was keen to win back business from Cunard, another shipping line known to have the fastest ships. He sailed on Titanic in 1912 but survived the ship sinking. The Cunard line exists today and is like a cruise line, but recently released a new ship called the Queen Anne. William Perry. Lord Perry was chairman of the shipping building company Harlan and Wolff, born in Canada to Irish parents. He grew up in Ireland and began to work for Harlan and Wolff in 1862. Perry was booked to sail the Titanic but cancelled because he was sick. His home in London is an embassy to Spain today. For the groundwork, there was nowhere a ship as large as Titanic could be built, and few docks in the world were deep enough for it. Before the ships could be built, Harlan and Wolff had to expand their shipyard in Belfast. A ship on dry land. The first stage of building a ship takes place in a special part of the shipyard called a dry dock, which looks like a trench. Then the ship is launched into the water and finished or fitted out while floating. In Belfast, 3 docks were turned into larger ones with a base of concrete that was 4 feet 6 inches deep. A huge framework called a gantry was then built over them. There was more than 840 feet long, 270 feet wide, and 228 feet high. The gantry had a set of cranes that ran on rails to move along the ships and lift heavy parts. The huge central crane could lift plates weighing up to 5 tons high above the ship's frame. Other cranes could lift heavier weight, shorter distance. All the building equipment on the dock was powered by electricity from Harlan and Wolff's electric generators. There were nearby workshops to produce many of the items that would go into the ships. The plots and plans. For more than 2 years after Perry and Ismay's meeting, a team of designers and architects planned Titanic right down to the last detail. Chief designer Alexander Carlisle created the main design following the style of earlier White Star ships. From this, engineers drew up detailed working plans. They had to know how different materials, construction, and shapes behave in a working ship and on the sea. The draftsmen used pencil, erasers, pen and ink, rulers, T-squares, and long rolls of paper laid on huge tables. Naval architect Edward Wilding and his assistants carried out the calculation to make the ship stable, all by hand as there were no computers back then. They had to make sure Titanic would be lighter than the same volume of water it displaced when fully loaded so it didn't sink. The center of the gravity had to be low too, with most of its weight low down so the ship didn't tip over. 2 historical figures in this page. Alexander Carlisle, Irishman. He started as an apprentice at Harlan and Wolff at the age of 16. He designed most of the White Star's great liners, including the Titanic. Thomas Andrew. When Carlisle retired in 1910, he took over managing the design of Titanic. He also worked his way up from an apprentice. Andrews died on the Titanic. Find your way around the Titanic. Titanic had miles of corridors and walkways, along with hundreds of rooms from tiny storage cupboards to huge engine rooms, all shown on the plans. Some drawings gave an overview while others showed all the details, down to every rivet. Bare bones, the framework of a ship like Titanic is built from the bottom up. Building began on March 31st, 1909, with laying the 300-foot-long keel, the steel backbone that ran down the middle of the ship. It lay on wooden blocks in a cradle that would hold the entire ship. Mechanics and engineers could go beneath and all around it. Above the keel lay a double bottom with a gap of 5 feet 3 inches between the two layers. The top layers was called the tank top. This was most divided into 46 ballast tanks, which stored water to make the ship heavier and keep it stable as Titanic weights dropped when cold water and food were used up. Water was added to the tanks to keep the ship's weight same. The framework, 300 thick steel frames bolted to the tank top, spaced every 2 to 3 feet, made at the metal skeleton inside the hull horizontally. Girders supported the decks. Vertical dividers, called bulkheads, split the ship into 16 watertight compartments. Doors in the bulkhead closed automatically if water rose in a compartment. 4 compartments could flood without Titanic sinking. Each frame was just over 60 feet long. Girders were cut to the length on site. These massive lumps of metal were heated in a furnace and bent into shape before being fitted into place. The Titanic's hull was built by fastening 2,000 huge plates of steel to the ship's framework, called a steel skin. The masses of metal, the plates were up to 1.5 inches thick, most of them almost 6 feet wider, 30 feet long, but the largest were 36 feet long and weighed 4.5 tons. Although a ship is made of heavy metal, it floats because it contains empty spaces. The average density of the whole ship, including the metal and the empty spaces, is lower than the density of water. Moving such massive components was a challenge. Heavy parts were made on site or shipped to Belfast by boat. Horse-drawn carts hauled massive loads through the streets, and the cranes, chains, and winches of the gantry lifted them into place. A riveting today the steel plates would be welded together using molten metal as a kind of glue. In 1910 they were fastened together with 3 million iron rivets. Workmen drove them through the holes in the plates using a hammer or hydraulic riveter as their version of an automatic hammer. Men worked in a team of 5. One heated up the rivets, which were held with tongs and passed to a catch boy. He then gave it to a holder-up, who held it in place, while 2 men hammered the opposite end of the rivet flat. In good weather, a team could manage 200 rivets in a day. It was hard and deafening work. They launched, but wasn't going anywhere. With the main structure complete, Titanic was launched on May 31st, 1911. The launch is when the ship first goes into the water. Once this happens, there's still a lot of work to do, called fitting out. At 12:15 p.m. on May 31st, 1911, is when 100,000 people watched 2 signal rockets were fired and the blocks were removed, allowing Titanic to slide backward, stern first into the water. The slipway was greased with soap, tallow, and oil to help the ship slide out, even slowed by giant chains. The Titanic took just 62 seconds to launch. 5 tugs, much smaller boats, hauled the Titanic short distance to the Thompson graving dock, where it would be completed. The graving dock had a floating crane to lift objects onto the ship. It could be drained of water for tasks such as fitting the propellers and painting the hull. Full steam ahead. Titanic used steam engines to turn propellers that pushed the ship forward. The steam to drive the engine was generated by burning coal to heat water. Steam engines. 2 vast reciprocating engines and a steam turbine drove the 3 propellers inside Steam at high pressure pushed pistons first in one direction, and then the other, pumping them backwards and forwards inside the cylinders. The pistons' movement turned the propellers. When steam left the reciprocating engine, it could be used to turn the turbine, which then turned the central propeller. This was used when the ship was going faster than half speed. Finally, a network of pipes carrying cold seawater cooled the steams, condensing it back into the water that could be reused. Let me get some lemonade here first. Best lemonade ever. Cutting through the waves. A propeller looks like a giant fan attached to a thick metal shaft. Titanic had 3 huge propellers, one on either side of the stern and one in the middle. The outer propellers were largest, almost 24 feet across. Each weighed 38 tons. To install giant parts like these, a crane lifted them, and they were held into place by chains and slings while men worked on them. To turn the ship uses a rudder and a wide flat hinge plate attached by the stern. The rudder is moved by a helmsman turning a wheel on the bridge. Titanic's rudder weighed over 100 tons and was 78 feet tall. Moving the rudder to the right or left reduces water pressure on one side and increases it on the other, turning the ship. The ship turns in the same direction as the rudder. Going and stopping. Titanic was fitted with 3 massive anchors that were dropped to the seafloor and held the ship in one place. Titanic's biggest anchors weighed in at nearly 18 tons and was larger than any anchor made before. To make it, carpenters carved a wooden model of the anchor head. This was pressed into sand to make a mold, and the mold was filled with molten irons. The anchors uses a total of nearly 1,200 feet of chain, so heavy that it took 2 men to drag each 176-pound chain link from the furnace where it was forged. The anchors were moved, lowered, and raised using a capstan, a horizontal wheel turned by several men that would wound up or unwound the chains. Okay. Unsinkable. Titanic's owner believed that its thoughtful construction and modern safety features made the ship unsinkable. Titanic had 16 wooden lifeboats and 4 collapsible lifeboats, all of which were kept on the boat deck. That was enough to meet safety regulations, but not enough for everyone on board. The lifeboats had space for 1,178 people, but the ship could carry about 3,300 people. Lifeboats were lowered into the water by mechanical arms called davits. As well as the lifeboats, there were around 3,500 adult life jackets, 300 children's life jackets, and 48 life preserver rings. Emergency messages. Titanic's radio system could be used to contact other ships and coast guards in emergencies, though its main use was for passenger messages. The ship also had distress rockets that could be fired to raise an alarm and alert nearby vessels of the ship's location. Finally finished. After nearly a year of fitting, the grand interior had been completed. The funnels had been fitted, the ship had been painted, and the engines had been installed and tested. Titanic was finally finished, just 3 years after its keel had been laid. Titanic was handed over to White Star Line on April 2, 1912, and sailed from Belfast to Southampton. The next day on that voyage, Titanic reached its top speed of 26 miles per hour. The ship spent 6 days at Southampton, where it was loaded with over 6,613 tons of cargo and luggage, which was stowed in the hold on the lowest deck. Finally, passengers began to board at 9:30 a.m. on April 10th. At noon, Titanic officially set sail on her maiden voyage. Their first stop was in Cherbourg, France, to board more passengers. Titanic was too large for the dock at Cherbourg, so passengers were brought aboard by ferries after a final stop at Queenstown, now called Cobb, in the south of Ireland, it set across the Atlantic for its final destination in New York. A record breaker. Titanic and its sister ship Olympic, which was completed first, was a record breaker. They were the largest moving objects that had ever been built. Titanic was also the most luxurious. When it left for its main voyage, Titanic carried plenty of fuel and supplies for the journey, including 6,611 tons of coal, 2,500 pounds of sausage, and 7,500 blankets. In the cargo hold, there was a wide range of goods and property to be shipped across the Atlantic. These included a Renault car, 12 cases of ostrich feathers, as well as casks of teas, cases of rubber, grandfather clocks, and 79 goat skins. The good had a total value of $420,000, equivalent to $10 million today. Know your place. Passengers on Titanic could travel first class, second class, or third class. The ship could carry 2,439 passengers, although only around half the tickets were sold for its first voyage. Going down, there were 284 second-class passengers, just under a quarter of the total. Many were tourists or servants working for first-class passengers. Their cabins had 2 to 4 bunks beds with a sink but no bathroom. The average price for a second-class ticket was $60, which would be $1,375 today. Top notch. First-class tickets for the 7-day voyage were the most expensive and bought the most luxurious rooms and the best food. The most expensive suites each had 2 large bedrooms, walk-in closet, and a bathroom, and cost $4,350, equivalent to $100,000 today. Cheaper first-class cabins were $150, $3,500 today. There were 324 first-class passengers, around a quarter of the total. The bottom of the pile, third class or steerage passengers had simple cabins, the largest of which held up to 10 people. There were only 2 bathtubs for the whole of third class. There were 709 third-class passengers on board, just over half the total. Most of them were immigrating to America to start new lives. They paid $15 to $40, which would be $350 to $900 today for their tickets. The historical figure of this page, I'm going to do my best to pronounce this name, the Larache family. Joseph Larache was a Haitian engineer who lived in France with his French wife and 2 daughters. The family traveled second class, returning to Haiti via New York. Joseph died when the Titanic sank, but his wife and daughters survived. Life on the ocean. For first-class passengers, Titanic was like a grand hotel. First-class areas were extravagantly decorated and linked by grand staircases made of carved oak and wrought iron. The front grand staircase had a glass dome, a crystal chandelier, and decorative glass. Titanic had a promenade deck for each class, and passengers weren't allowed on the deck of another class. People could walk, play games, or sit on deck chairs. The 2 most expensive first-class suites had private promenade decks. First-class passengers could use an indoor swimming pool, Turkish and electric baths as a type of sauna back in the day, a gym, and squash courts. The pool measured 30 by 14 feet and was filled with heated seawater. The ticket price for pool entry, 25 cents, which is $6 today, included swimsuit rentals. The gym had sailing and rowing machines and an electric horse, an electric caramel for riding exercise. Men and women used the fitness area at different times. Divided dining. Passengers of different classes ate in different dining rooms. First-class passengers could also eat in the restaurant, the Café Parisien, or in their cabins. Passengers in the third-class dining room ate simple meals of soup, meat, vegetables, and fruit, but even there they were served by stewards, making music. 8 professional musicians entertained first-class Passengers, first and second class passengers, had the use of 5 fine Steinway pianos, and there were also a bass piano in the third class. Historical figure of this page: Charles Proctor, as head chef, was the second highest paid person on the ship after the captain. He was in charge of cooking and serving more than 6,000 meals a day. He died when the ship sank. A hard day at work. Passengers had free time on board, but the crew and other staff on Titanic were hard at work. The hardest work of all was in the engine and boilers room, tending their fires, working 4-hour shifts or watches. 150 stokers, 20 trimmers, and 5 leading stokers kept the boilers running day and night. It was hot, back-breaking work in the belly of the ship, filled with choking coal dust. Trimmers shoveled coal from the bunkers into wheelbarrows, taking it from both sides of the ships to keep Titanic's weight balanced. They dumped the coal on plates in front of the furnaces. Then stokers shoveled it into the furnaces. A gong went off when coal was needed to keep the right level of steam for the ship's speed. The ship burned coal in 159 furnaces, which heated water in 29 giant boilers. The coal stores and boilers lay along the ship's bottom of the tank top. Fuels and chimneys took waste gases and soot from the furnaces out through the first 3 funnels. The boiler started up 12 hours before the engines were needed. It took that long for each of the boilers to reach the pressure necessary for them to power the ship. The historical figure on this page: John Priest, one of the 12 children, was a stoker who shoveled coal into the furnaces. Priest survived the sinking of Titanic and 4 other ship sinkings. Below decks, 24 engineers and 6 electricians under Chief Engineer Joseph Bell kept a constant watch on the ship's machinery, from boilers and plumbing to communication and lighting. Around the clock, at any time, 4 engineers looked after the engines, turbine, pumps, and steering gears. Another 3 worked in the boiler room, supervising the stokers, trimmers, and greasers, who kept the machinery running smoothly. They made sure everything worked properly and was kept clean, and that equipment was oiled and adjusted as necessary. Working with passengers between the deck and the tank tops, other staff worked with passengers, including stewards, cleaners, waiters, and the purser. The purser's office dealt directly with passengers, booking the squash court and swimming pool, renting out deck chairs, handling telegrams, looking after valuables, and answering questions and complaints. One historical figure on this page: Hugh Walter McKellery, an Irishman, was chief purser, born in Liverpool to an Irish family. He had worked with White Star Line for 13 years. When he joined Titanic, Elroy remained on board to oversee the evacuation and died when the ship sank. Give me some lemonade. Steering a course. Although the ocean, I don't know where I got that from, looks featureless, a ship has to navigate current, watch out for weather changes, and avoid dangers such as the other ship and icebergs. A chain of command. 8 deck officers and a captain controlled Titanic. The senior officer on duty used the ship's compass and decided the ship's course and speed base on information from the lookouts, who spotted passing ships and obstacles. He passed orders to the helmsman, who used the ship's wheel to steer and used the telegraph system to send instructions to engineers in the engine room. The telegraph sent commands for 11 speeds, setting from full speed ahead to dead slow, both forward and backwardly, plus standby and setting stop. A historical figure: Edward Smith was captain of Titanic after starting work at 14 in a foundry. He began working on sailing ships, then moved to steamships with White Star Line. He worked his way up to captain. As the captain of Titanic, Smith felt it was his duty to stay with his ship, and he did not survive the sink. In touch, Titanic had the usual communication system of its time for a ship with radio sets used to send and receive telegrams. Over the wave, wireless telegraphy used radio waves to send signals as a series of pulses. These messages were called telegrams. Radio did not carry voice signals at the time, and telephones still required wires connecting the equipment, so neither could be used at sea. Telegrams were sent using Morse code, which mapped each letters of the alphabet to a sequence of dots and dashes, short and long electrical pulses. The main task of Titanic's telegraph operators was to handle passengers' messages, but the telegraph system would play a vital yet faded role on Titanic's voyage across the Atlantic. Telegrams were the only ways ships could communicate with each other, to give warnings and ask for help. Historical figure: Jack Phillips trained as a wireless operator with Marconi in 1906 at the age of 19. He worked on different ships for 6 years until he was posted as chief wireless officer on Titanic. He died when it sank. Iceberg ahead. Around noon on April 14th, Titanic received the first warning from another ship about dangerous ice. Iceberg warnings continued to arrive all afternoon and evening, but no icebergs were visible from Titanic. Warnings were ignored. At 10:55 p.m., SS Californian sent a message saying they were surrounded by ice and had stopped. Californian was just 20 miles away, but Phillips was preoccupied sending and receiving passenger messages and picking up news for passengers to read in the morning, and he ignored the warning. Iceberg sighted at 11:39 p.m. One of the two lookouts on Titanic Frederick Fleet saw a deep dark space where there were no stars in the sky. A huge iceberg blocked his view of them. By then it was only a quarter of a mile away. On the starboard right side of the ship, Fleet rang the warning bell 3 times and telephoned the bridge. Frederick Fleet, 25-year-old, was born in Liverpool and brought up by foster families and distant relatives until he became a deck boy in 1903. Fleet was on one of the lifeboats and survived. Okay, disaster strikes. The warning came too late. The first officer in charge, William McMaster Murdoch, ordered the ship to be turned and the engines put into reverse. He demanded the watertight doors of the bulkheads be closed in case of impact. But ships are slow to turn and stop. There was no time to avoid the iceberg. Titanic struck it at 11:40 p.m. All quiet, many passengers already slept around 11:40 p.m. and were woken by the sound of the engines turning off. Some survivors reported a grating sensations or a slight bump. It didn't seem serious to them. Taking on the water, the impact with the iceberg made rivets pop from the hull, causing the steel plates to separate. The ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, was sailing on the board and went immediately to survey the damage. He realized within minutes that 6 of the 16 bulkheads had flooded. The ship was designed to stay afloat with only 4 flooded. Although the doors between compartments had been closed, the ship had already taken on too much water. Andrews told the captain the ship would sink within 2 hours. The SOS Titanic. As the crew realized the disaster was unfolding, their efforts turned to rescue, but Titanic was far from land and other ships. A cry for help. This first distress signal sent out at 12:15 a.m. on April 15th read, "Come at once, we have struck iceberg. It's a CQD." Old man CQD was the most common distress signal used at the time. CQ meant all stations and D stood for distress. Later, telegraph operator Harold Bright suggested using the newer SOS signal. The cries go unheard. No ships close enough to help respond. Titanic's messages were recorded by more distant ships and show growing desperation. At 12:40 a.m., SOS Titanic sinking by the head. We are about all down sinking. At 1:30 a.m., women and children in boats cannot last much longer, was the message. The final message at 1:45 a.m. Our engine room is filling up to the boilers. Lighting up the sky as well as sending telegrams, Titanic launched distress flares rockets that soar into the sky and explode in a blaze of light. At least one ship, Californians, saw a flare but thought it was a harmless signal rocket. Man, lifeboats. Titanic's lifeboats were stored at the top of the ship. Once loaded with passengers, the boats were lowered 70 feet by ropes into the freezing sea. No panic. Most passengers remained unconcerned even when they realized the ship had struck an iceberg. Some even played with chunks of ice on the deck when the stewards woke passengers, telling them to put on warm clothes and life jackets and go on deck. Many thought it was just a precaution. Into the boats. Crew members began to prepare the lifeboats at midnight, then began loading women and children into them. Titanic had 20 lifeboats with space to hold 1,178, but there were more than 2,200 people on board. Captain Smith ordered the lifeboats to be launched at 12:30 a.m. They began to leave 10 minutes later, but the evacuation was chaotic and many boats were left with empty spaces. The first had only 28 passengers despite having room for 65. Many passengers still believed the ship was unsinkable and were unwilling to take to the freezing sea. One passenger, Charles H. Remind, reported later, "It was my opinion the officers were making a mountain out of a molehill and I had no intentions of getting into any of the boats." The last lifeboat left at 2:15 a.m. There were still 1,500 people on board. Working on while Captain Smith directed operations, stewards roused passengers and urged them to put on life jackets and go to the upper deck. Engineers and boilers men continued to work below deck, meaning the engines far down in the hold. The men in the boiler and engine room continued to work even as water flooded. They released built-up steam to prevent an explosion when ice-cold seawater met the hot boilers. They kept the generators going to power pump to remove the water to keep the light on so people could see to escape and to keep the telegraph system working. These men were so low on the ship that none of the engineers and electricians survived. Music to the end. Titanic's musicians played to calm down passengers, initially the first-class lounge and eventually on the boat deck. All 8 musicians died when the ship sank. A historical figure on this page. Joseph Bell, the chief engineer, grew up in northern England. When he trained as an engineer, on the night of the disaster, he organized the engine staff to keep working. He did not survive the sinking. Sinking the unsinkable. Titanic had been considered unsinkable because its watertight bulkhead should have kept water in isolated areas, but there were errors in its design. Perhaps the biggest flaw in the Titanic's design was that the walls between the compartments didn't go all the way up to the top decks. This meant that when the ship took on a large amount of water, it could eventually spill over the top of the bulkheads into other previously dry compartments. With the front of the ship flooded, the end became heavy and sank lower in the water. Broken apart. As the front end of the ship sank lower, the stern rose out of the water at 2:18. With the stern upright, the lights on the Titanic finally went out. Passengers and crew were plunged into darkness. The immense pressure caused by its position broke Titanic in half. Then there was nothing to stop the water from flooding the entire ship. Most of the 1,000 people left aboard fell or jumped into the seawater, where most died from the cold within a few minutes. The final screams for help died away at 3:20 a.m. The first rescue ship was sighted 10 minutes later. Rescue for some. Many of the lifeboats refused to go back and rescue people in the water. When the RMS Carpathia arrived at the scene around 3:30 a.m., it found the sea awash with dead bodies and freezing passengers and lifeboats. In all, the 2/3 of the people on Titanic perished. Nearly 700 crew members and 520 28 third-class passengers died, some of 167 second-class passengers. 122 first-class passengers died. In possible odds, third-class accommodation was farthest from the boat decks where the lifeboats were kept, while the first-class accommodations were right next to the lifeboats. The first-class cabins were well served by stewards, while fewer stewards looked after the people in third class. First-class passengers were allowed into lifeboats first. Many third-class passengers didn't speak English, so they did not understand the instructions that they were given. Worst of all, many routes from third-class quarters to the top of the ship were blocked, or even locked. There was simply no escape. Survivors were helped from lifeboats onto Carpathia, where they were given blankets, food, and water. Some were reunited with friends and relatives, while others struggled with grief. Carpathia took them to New York. When they arrived on April 18th, news of the sinking had already reached the city, and the survivors were met by a crowd of 40,000 people. It was then that the world learned the true extent of the disaster. Points of weakness. How did the unsinkable Titanic sink? 2 investigations were held immediately, one in the United Kingdom and one in the United States. Many experts have investigated the disaster since. The bulkheads that were supposed to keep Titanic safe stopped just 10 feet above the waterline, so water splashed over into neighboring compartments. The pumps were overwhelmed by the amount of water and couldn't remove it quickly enough. If Titanic had not had the bulkheads, water would have flowed evenly through the ship. In that case, it's possible that Titanic would not have tidaled or broken in half and might have stayed afloat until rescuers arrived. Their fatal mistake. Titanic had few lifeboats to carry everyone on board. White Star Line had refused to install more lifeboats, as it was felt that they cluttered up the promenade decks and gave the impression that the ship was unsafe. Many lifeboats were launched with empty seats, although 500 more could have been saved if the boats had been filled to capacity. Research has found that instead of the iceberg tearing a hole in the hull, pressure forced rivets to break or pop out, allowing the sheet of metal to separate. Many of these rivets were faulty and made from poor quality metal, so they were weak. The hull was more brittle at low temperatures than modern steel, so instead of bending, it shattered. Learning from their mistakes. Some of the causes of the Titanic disaster were human error. The ship was traveling too fast and warnings about ice were ignored. Too few lifeboats were supplied and they weren't filled to capacities. These mistakes were corrected for future ships. They were fixed the Olympic. After the sinking, Titanic's sister ship Olympic returned from the Atlantic to dry dock in Belfast, where it underwent safety improvements. The double bottom was extended up the sides of the hull. This meant that a collision might make a hole in the outer hull, but leave the inner layer unharmed so that the ship would not flood with water. The bulkheads were extended by almost 20 feet so they came up to B deck. This would stop from water spilling between the watertight compartments from above. And more lifeboats were added to. There were enough places for everyone on board. Changing the rules. Changes to shipping rules also made ships safer after 1912. All ships had to have radio systems that were constantly on so they could contact other ships or coastal radio operations in an emergency. An international ice patrol was set up in 1914 to warn ships in the North Atlantic about icebergs. Dredging the deep. Titanic still lies 12,500 feet underwater in the North Atlantic Ocean. For decades, Titanic wreck was lost. The last location Titanic reported was wrong, and parts of the wreck drifted as they sank. Oceanographer Robert Ballard was one of the many people keen to find Titanic, making his first unsuccessful attempt in 1977. Determined, he returned with new technology in the 1980s. Work on other wrecks showed him that a sinking ship leaves a debris trail. In 1985, he searched Titanic's trail using a remote-controlled submersible that could scan the seafloor. After a week of searching, his team spotted Titanic's boiler and other debris. The next day, they found the main part of the wreck. Since 1985, researchers and divers have visited the wreck many times. Photographs and information from these trips have been used to make computer models of the Titanic that help reveal what happened to the ship. The wreck is being eaten away by sea creatures and microbes. Iron is turning into rusticles that looks like icicles. The wreck might not last centuries. I apologize. The wreck might last centuries or only decades. More than 5,000 objects have been removed from Titanic, and many can be seen in museums, but the wreck is now protected. It will be left as a memorial to the people who died in the sinking. There's 2 museums in the U.S., one in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, one in Branson, Missouri. I've been to the one in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, and it is absolutely amazing. So if you're ever in Branson, Missouri, or Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, I encourage you guys to check it out. I heard there's one over in Europe somewhere, but I've never been to that. But I heard it's neat. Until then, Evan's saying, enjoy the rest of your day.